November 16, 1966, a small-town newspaper in West Virginia ran a headline that no editor wants to write, not because it was shocking, though it was, but because nobody knew what to call the thing they were describing. A creature, man-sized, wings, eyes that glowed red in the dark. Within days, the story would spread across the country. Within 13 months, it would attach itself to one of the deadliest bridge collapses in American history. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it would vanish, leaving behind a question that still hasn't been answered. What did the people of Point Pleasant actually see? This is the true story of the Mothman. Point Pleasant, West Virginia. A town of around 5,000 people sitting where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio. In 1966, it looked like 1,000 other small American towns. Quiet streets, a downtown strip, a steel bridge that carried traffic across the river since 1928. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a place anyone expected to become famous. But 7 miles north of town sat a stretch of land with a strange history of its own. During the Second World War, the U.S. government built a massive munitions plant there, the West Virginia Ordnance Works. The $45 million facility employed 3,500 workers at its peak, operating from 1942 to 1945, producing TNT for the war effort. When the war ended, the plant shut down. It was officially declared surplus to the Department of Defense in December of 1945. What was left behind was strange enough on its own. Nearly 100 massive concrete domes, called igloos, built into the earth to store explosives, designed specifically so they couldn't be spotted from the air. The locals called it simply the TNT area. Abandoned, overgrown, riddled with tunnels and bunkers. By the 1960s, it had become the kind of place teenagers dared each other to drive into at night, and it would become the backdrop for one of America's strangest unsolved mysteries. Let's start where the story starts, not in Point Pleasant, but 3 days earlier and a little further away.
3 days before that newspaper headline, in the town of Clendenin, about an hour from Point Pleasant, a group of gravediggers were working in a cemetery. They glanced up from their work as something huge soared over their heads, a massive figure moving rapidly from tree to tree. One of them later put it simply, "If I had seen it while by myself, I wouldn't have said anything, but there were 4 of us who saw it." That detail matters. Multiple witnesses, together, at the same time. It's the first thread in what would become a pattern over the next 13 months. And it's worth remembering as we go, because almost every account that follows shares that same feature. Not one frightened person alone in the dark, but groups independently reporting the same thing. The gravedigger's story didn't make national news. It was a local oddity, easily dismissed. But 3 days later, that would change.
On the night of November 15th, 2 young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette, were driving near the old TNT area on the outskirts of town. They reported seeing a large man-sized creature with wings and red glowing eyes. According to their account, the figure was tall and grey, humanoid in outline, standing with its wings folded against its back, its eyes glowing a fierce, unnatural red. They described a wingspan of roughly 10 feet on something built like a man. What happened next is the detail that turned a strange sighting into a sensation. They claimed the creature followed their car as they fled the area. The couple said it pursued them at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, keeping pace with the vehicle. They drove straight to the Mason County courthouse and told the police what they'd seen. The following day, the Point Pleasant Register ran the headline, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something." National press picked up the story almost immediately, spreading it across the United States. A name appeared almost as fast as the story did. Inspired partly by the Batman television series popular at the time, and partly by the creature's avian features, newspapers settled on a label that would outlive everyone involved: Mothman. Now, here's where a responsible retelling has to slow down, because what we know for certain is this: 4 named individuals gave a consistent account to police on the record the same night. That's documented fact. What that account actually means, what they saw, is where things get harder to pin down. We'll come back to that question, but first, the sightings kept coming.
Within weeks, Point Pleasant was a town transformed. News of the creature spread like wildfire, and paranoia ran through the community. People who had never given a second thought to the old TNT area now avoided it entirely after dark. Local hunters reportedly armed themselves before heading into the woods. And the reports didn't stop. Journalist John Keel, a writer and paranormal researcher who relocated to the area to investigate, would later claim that over the following 13 months, sightings continued throughout Point Pleasant area, and that more than 100 witnesses came forward describing encounters with the creature or related strange phenomena. That number deserves a caveat. It comes from Keel himself in his later book, and it has never been independently verified against police or newspaper archives. We'll discuss Keel's role and the questions historians have raised about his reliability later in this video. But even allowing for exaggeration, the volume of local reports was clearly enough to dominate the town's attention for over a year. One of the people most central to documenting the phenomenon in real time wasn't Keel. It was a local reporter named Mary Heyer, who worked for the Athens Messenger and covered Point Pleasant for the Register. Heyer fielded calls from frightened residents, investigated reports herself, and became in many ways the on-the-ground chronicler of everything happening in her town. She would die unexpectedly in 1970 after a short illness, a death some later writers framed as suspicious, though there is no credible evidence connecting it to her reporting. We mention it here only because her name will come up again.
Descriptions across the sightings weren't identical, but common threads appeared again and again. A creature roughly the height of a man, greyish or brownish in colour, with large wings and most distinctively eyes that reflected light back as a bright, glowing red. That eye detail is one of the most consistent elements across the accounts, and as we'll see shortly, it's also one of the most important clues for the scientific explanation. The sightings weren't confined to one location. Reports came from along the riverbanks, near the old ordnance works, and around the edges of town. The creature, in the testimony of those who claimed to see it, was typically airborne or perched, never confirmed to have made contact with anyone.
The Mothman wasn't the only strange story attached to this corner of West Virginia during this period.
Around the same time, a traveling salesman named Woodrow Derenberger reported an encounter on Interstate 77 near Parkersburg with what he described as an unusual vehicle and a man who identified himself telepathically, Derenberger said, using the name Indrid Cold. John Keel later connected this account to other reports of strange, smiling men appearing and disappearing around witnesses, and to what UFO researchers call men in black, mysterious figures allegedly warning witnesses to stay silent. It's important to be direct here. This part of the story sits on much shakier ground than the original Mothman sightings. Skeptical researchers, including author Brian Dunning, have noted there is no corroborating evidence for some of Keel's claims, and that Derenberger's own daughter has stated her father never described Cold's smile the way Keel characterized it. Folklorist David Clark has gone further, observing that Keel's own distinction between fact and fiction in his work was, in Clark's words, a very fine one. We include this not because it's verified history, but because no honest account of the Mothman legend can ignore how thoroughly Keel's writing shaped the version of the story most people know today. Separating his documented field reporting from his later, more speculative interpretations is one of the central challenges of this case, and we'll return to it in Part 2.
By the autumn of 1967, Point Pleasant had lived alongside this mystery for nearly a year. The sightings had become almost routine, frightening but familiar. That was about to change in a way nobody could have predicted. If you want to understand how this story collided with one of the deadliest infrastructure disasters in American history, and what serious investigators then and now believe was really happening in those woods, stay with us for Part 2. Subscribe to the Mystery Archive and turn on notifications, because we are about to walk across the Silver Bridge on the last night it ever stood.